Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to BTC Radio Audiobook and ASMR. I'm thrilled to be your host today. Over the next few minutes, we'll embark on a journey through the airwaves, exploring diverse topics, sharing stories. So, sit back, relax, and let us be the soundtrack to your day. Stay tuned for an unforgettable experience right here. Tonight you are listening to Jews in Many Lands by Elkan Nathan Adler, Part 4. Part 4. Hebron, the Dead Sea, and the Jordan. Tuesday City or Friendship. Hebron, or Khalil, the City of Friendship, is perhaps the oldest city of the Holy Land, and in interest it vies with Jerusalem itself. Among us Jews it is reverently described as Max 3p, the burial ground of our fathers, and a pilgrimage thither is highly esteemed. The Mohammedans regard it with even more reverence as a sacred place than Jerusalem, for is it not the last resting place of Abraham, El-Khalil Allah, the friend of God and his great prophet? Their regard, although flattering to the founder of our race, carries with it the disadvantage that it makes the Hebronites the most fanatical of the followers of Islam, and the most intolerant. Christians cannot live at Hebron, and Jews there are treated as dogs. Curses both loud and deep greeted us as we walked round the great mosque, which encloses the cave of Machpelah, but, as we did not understand the meaning of the imprecations or appreciate the delicacy or appropriateness of the choice epithets applied to us, and, as the missiles thrown at us were not well aimed, we could afford to treat our reception with amused nonchalance. Nowhere in the East did I meet with such bigotry as at Hebron, and it did not surprise me to learn that Dr. Stein, the medical man whom we sent out there some time ago, has no Mohammedans among his clientele, because the Hebronites, unlike the Mohammedans who live in Jerusalem and elsewhere, are too utter fatalists to believe that medicine can arrest the progress of disease or the angel of death. Though the local government there and in the neighboring villages employs him occasionally, it is merely as a coroner to inspect a corpse or hold an inquest and certify the cause of death. Still he is honored with the title of government physician, and though his services are gratuitous, the fact that they are accepted adds to his influence. He is extremely well liked by the Jews, and they were unanimous in his praise. Dr. Stein takes great interest in the climatology of his station, and asked me to apply for him to the meteorological office for barometer, thermometer, and rain gauge. I ascertained that, for years past, no observations had been made nearer than Beirut, and Mr. Reginald Scott, the secretary of the office, gladly submitted my request to the council. However, they could not accede to it, because Hebron is not a seaport nor its weather likely to affect navigation. Hebron is the first town seen by the wanderer who reaches Palestine by way of the desert of Sinai. Even the most phlegmatic of temperaments cannot fail to be deeply impressed by a pilgrimage to the last resting place of the patriarchs. But quite apart from considerations of sentiment, the beauty of its position and almost English verdure of the slopes which surround it make Hebron preeminent. It is, therefore, by no means surprising to find that Dean Stanley and other writers are quite poetical in describing the contrast between the wilderness of rocks one has to traverse for many days, and the fertility of the well-watered valley in which it lies. The prevailing color of the surrounding cliffs is purple, and the Mohammedans say that from the red earth of Hebron, Adam, the first man, was formed, and that thence he derived his name. The connection thus made between Adam and Edom, or Esau, the traditional patriarch of the Arabs of Syria, is worthy of note. That Adam was also buried here, both Talmudical and Mohammedan legends agree. Its early name, Kiryat Arba, which might mean the city of the four patriarchs, is pointed to as evidence in favor of that hypothesis. Machpelah. The mosque, built of red and white marble, is almost square, and its four minarets, one rising from each corner, give it a characteristic appearance. The massive smooth-hewn stones of the enclosing wall remind one of the ruins of the temple, and the 60 square buttresses and cornices all around remain to show us how strongly fortified it must have been at the time when the Crusaders were borrowing territorial titles from Hebron, and the Saracens were winning back the territory itself. Like all the holy places it has passed through many vicissitudes, and had been both temple and church before Saladin made a mosque out of it. Into the mosque itself, no GR is permitted to enter without the Sultan's special firman. This was obtained by the Prince of Wales when he went there in 1862, and the visit is graphically described in Stanley's Sinai and Palestine. But without a firman the most powerful persuasives will not secure an entrance. Even Baron and Baroness Edmund de Rothschild could not succeed in getting the Pasha of Palestine to admit them on his own responsibility, and so, although they traveled by land all over Palestine, Hebron they did not visit. And Mr. Ben Levy has told me that a bribe of £500 was not sufficient to make the governor of Hebron, or the sheikh of the mosque, stretch a point in his case. In a corner of the enclosing wall, near the lofty entrance which fronts the mosque, is a small gap built up with smooth stones, but leaving sufficient space for a man to crawl through. This unofficial entrance leads to the subterranean chambers, and on the eve of our festivals we Jews are permitted to come here to pray, as we do at the Wailing Place at Jerusalem. Of course, we are not permitted to go down the narrow passage into the world-old vault or cave below, but there are not unnaturally many Jewish folktales which cluster round the spot. Ludwig A. Frankel, for instance, gives the origin of the Purim Taka, or Window Purim, still celebrated by the Sephardic Jews of Hebron on the anniversary of their deliverance from an intolerable tax. It appears that once there was a pasha there who was very fond of money. Fired by the memory of the methods of King Richard the Lion-Hearted, or perhaps of his own sweet initiative, for great minds think alike, His Excellency determined to get money out of his Jewish subjects. He demanded 50,000 piastres under threat of killing the leading members of the community and selling the rest into slavery. The rabbis were direly perplexed, for they could not scrape the sum together. At last, they could think of no other expedient than to write to the patriarchs about their trouble. They did so, and bribed the watchman of the mosque to lower the petition by a string into the cave of Machpelah, for, of course, even he dared not enter there. That night the Pasha woke up and, at his bedside, found 3 venerable-looking sages, who demanded 50,000 piastres of him, and threatened him with death if he did not pay. The Pasha saw that they were in earnest, went to his money-bags, and paid the 50,000 to the 3 weird old men. Next morning, at break of day, the Pasha's soldiers come to the Jewish quarter to fetch the 50,000 subsidy he levied upon them. The Jews are all in synagogue, praying, for they know their last hour has come. The soldiers knock at the door, and the beadle hurries to open it, when he notices a bag of money in the hall, just where the people wash their hands before entering the synagogue. He brings it to the Parnas, who hands it to the Pasha. The Pasha recognizes both purse and money as his own, and declares that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves rose from their grave to keep him from an evil deed, and that the Jews must, indeed, be a people dear to Allah, if the patriarchs, after so many thousands of years, would come to life again merely to protect them from injury. He makes the community a present of the money, but requires them to promise to pray for him if ever he should be in trouble. There are elements of truth in this story, and obviously it is capable of a very rational explanation. The Jews or Hebron. The community used to be very small, and even in 1888 numbered barely 1,000 souls out of a total population of 10 times that number. About the year 1265 Nachmanides went to Palestine, and a short letter he wrote to his son Nachman gives us a vivid description of Palestine as it was left after the Crusades. In one word, he says, the unhappy rule seems to be that the holier a place may have been, the more desolate it is. Jerusalem was in ruins, and what had been marble places, were then hefker, waste or common lands, free to be appropriated by anybody who pleased. There was only a single minion of Jews there, who every Sabbath met in their houses for prayer. He persuaded them to set apart one of the less demolished buildings as a synagogue, and they actually sent to Shechem, Nablus, for a seper. He also went to Hebron, the city of the graves of our forefathers, that I might pray there, and buy myself a grave, and there be buried. In those times there was not a single Jew there. But 100 years before, when Benjamin of Tudela visited it in 1170, he found a few of our co-religionists living there, and, indeed, went down with some to the cave of Machpelah, which he describes and which was evidently not guarded so jealously in his time as it is now. Nowadays, there are about as many Ashkenazim as Sephardim, and each community has 3 synagogues. The Ashkenazim have no provision whatever for education, but there are about 60 pupils in the Talmud Torah of the Sephardim. It would be highly desirable if the Alliance Israelite or the Anglo-Jewish Association would see its way to establishing a school there of even the humblest dimensions. I gathered from the communal leaders that this they anxiously desired, and that, though poor, they would gladly contribute to the support of such a school. The Sephardi Chacham is Rachmim Franco, and the Ashkenazi rabbi are Simeon Manasseh Schlutzker, who is over 90 years old. There is only one Jew, a Mr. Romano, of even moderate means in the town, and he is rather an absentee landlord, for he lives the greater part of the year in Constantinople. He owns a fine large house, of course of stone, and the banqueting hall on the first floor would not disgrace a Norman castle. He is very hospitable, and Jewish guests are brought to his house quite as a matter of course to be boarded and lodged if necessary, just as though it were an hotel. Neither payment nor a present is accepted, but one is expected to contribute to the Pon Menanrin, the local Society for Good Works, which, of course, one is only too glad to do. Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed and Tiberias constitute the 4 holy cities of the Jews, and till colonization had altered matters, nearly all the Holy Land Jews resided in them. In Safed they constitute 1/2 of the 12,000 inhabitants, and in Tiberias they number 3,000 out of 5,000. Besides these, there are 1,000 Jews in Haifa, 1,000 in Sidon, and 2,000 in Jaffa, out of a total of 6, 12, and 15,000 respectively. There are only 150 Jews out of 10,000 in Acre, 120 at Shechem out of 18,000, and 120 at Gaza out of 20,000. Including 4,000 colonists, which is perhaps an overestimate, it would seem that, notwithstanding the recent immigration of Russian and Romanian Jews, there are not more than 43,500 of our co-religionists in Palestine out of a total population of over 500,000. A night ride. One Monday night about 9 o'clock we left the Hotel Jerusalem for the Jordan and the Dead Sea. We were a small but imposing caravan. First came our Bedouin escort, Sheikh of the village of Abu Dis, whose services we had engaged through the intervention of H.B.M. Consul. Then there was Dragoman Khalil, who was ostensibly in charge of the expedition. Next to him came the hotel keeper's son, Bezalel Kamenetz, my alter ego and Fidus Achates, who never left me out of sight from the time of my arrival in Jerusalem till my re-embarkation at Jaffa. Next came the muleteer Salim, whose mule was laden with good things, sufficient in amount as it seemed to me for 40 days and 40 nights wandering in the desert, but appetite surpassed expectation, and, like Aesop with the bread basket, Salim returned very much lighter than he went. All but myself were armed to the teeth, and the water bottles hanging from our saddles made me feel quite an explorer. Khalil was very proud of his gun, and after break of day kept pointing it in all directions. There was plenty of game about, and no game laws, and he was determined to do wonderful things in the slaughter of innocents. He stalked a good many sandgrouse, and once, in the plain of Jericho, his ambition soared even to a royal eagle, but his success was limited to the destruction of powder and shot and to frightening me. I had no mind to be his quarry, and, as we cantered on, language not altogether without strength was required to persuade him that there was no necessity for me to look down the barrels of his gun to know that he was using ball instead of shot. The muleteer was musical, and albeit the melody was but a nasal twang, and his theme the excellence of the food he carried, the song of Salim lent an air of romance to the expedition. It did not need this to make our midnight ride delightful. It is hopeless to attempt adequately to describe the glory of the starry night with the bright eyes of countless angels beaming sympathy with man. We felt in no talkative mood, and, once started, soon dropped into single file and gave our thoughts full rein. Of such a night in the Holy Land, Thackeray writes that the recollection of its sensations must remain with a man as long as his memory lasts, and he should feel them as often as he should talk of them little. We skirted the Mount of Olives, passed Bethany, and rode slowly on from one gorge to another, occasionally climbing a hill, but for the most part descending the bed of some dried-up torrent or wadi. The bridle path was rugged in the extreme, and dangerous in parts, so that we had several times to dismount and lead our horses by the bridle. Yet every now and then we came across traces of the old Roman road to Jericho, which proved that time was when, despite the considerable fall of nearly 4,000 feet in the 20 miles or so which separate Jerusalem from Jericho, they could not have been much more than a 3 hours' ride from one another. A caravansary. About halfway there, we reached a khan, or caravansary, with 2 huge portals, which looked as though they barred the way to some mighty building behind them. We thundered at the gates and made as much noise as we could, but not the slightest notice was taken of us. This confirmed me in my belief that here was an enchanted castle, but that I was not to be the lucky one to wake the sleeping beauty. Khalil grew impatient and fired his gun, but still no answer came. Our horses required a little rest, and so there was nothing for it but to dismount and lie down on the naked rock. I never slept so sound in my life, and, though they woke me up in less than half an hour, I felt as refreshed as though I had had a whole night's rest. The following afternoon we passed the Hadra Khan again on our way back. This time, after some parleying, we gained admittance, and found that the entire garrison consisted of but one poor old Arab, who lived in a dismantled little shanty in the corner of a large and empty courtyard surrounded by high stone walls. If there were any pigs in Palestine, which, except in 1 or 2 monasteries, there are not, I should have taken it for a pig-sty. Mine host was very attentive and made us Turkish coffee as best he could. He admitted that he had heard us the night before, but had taken us for Bedouins, of whom he lived in terror of his life. He showed us the inner door of the shanty all riddled with shot, and assured us that he had at one time been regularly besieged and all but captured and slain, for the sake of the 2 or 3 pewter blisklik coins he possessed. Jericho. We rode onward on our journey till we came to the Sultan's spring, perhaps the very same as that which Elisha's handful of salt had sweetened. This, or the Pool of Moses, close by, must have been intended as the scene of the famous interview in The Talisman between Saladin and the Prince of Scotland. A few minutes further on we rode through one of the noble arches of Herod's aqueduct, which boldly traverses the plain, and stopped a while to admire the massive ruins. Soon we reached the Russian hospice in Jericho, where we arrived about 3 in the morning. The approach to the world-famous or infamous place, once a love gift from Antony to Cleopatra, was through thick vegetation, which reminded me of some Surrey wood more than anything else. I know this will be regarded as a fault in local coloring, but really I saw no trace of the famous palms or roses or balsam gardens with which tradition glorifies Jericho. The vegetation is tropical because the natural depression of the plain and, indeed, of the whole of the gigantic fissures constituting the valley of the lower Jordan, makes the climate and temperature that of places 15 degrees nearer the equator. In the garden of the hospice grow bananas and figs and clustering grapes as in Egypt, but it is the fields of maize and other cereals, and the drooping willows, and scarlet flowers of the gum Arabic plant that most impress the traveler. The hospice itself contains rude woodcut portraits of the Tsar and other Russians, but is conspicuous for the absence of monks. It is intended for the shelter of pilgrims on the way to baptism in the Jordan, and is open to all comers, although no food is provided. The Dead Sea. After a short stay, and just as the sun was rising, we started for the Dead Sea 7 miles off. We had to ride across a plain which is fairly level except for a gentle downward slope. After leaving the fertile belt about 2 miles southeast of Jericho, we entered a barren tract quite devoid of vegetation. Here the soil underfoot is a sort of sandy clay coated with layers of asphalt and studded with tiny but bright crystals of salt. As soon as the shore of the lake was reached, the unexpected beauty of the scene almost took one's breath away. The water looked as lovely, blue, clear, and inviting as buttermere in the summer time. The hills around were higher and the precipices, especially on the eastern or Moab side, more abrupt, but the play of lights and shadows was the same, and the brilliant coloring of the limestone and plutonic rocks made up for the absence of foliage. Desolate the scene was, but there were none of the gruesome horrors expected in the Dead Sea. Though standing 1,300 feet below the ocean level, in the bowels of the earth as it were, we could not feel far from the world, when through the clear air we could distinctly see the bell tower on the Mount of Olives, 4,000 feet above us, and, as the crow flies, 25 miles away. A few days, before I had seen the Dead Sea, from that very tower, at sunset on the Sabbath day, and its dull gray or greenery yellow color made it seem typical of misery and mystery. But on its shores it was proximity, not distance, that lent enchantment to the view. Of course, I bathed in the water, and found it easy to swim in, but not so very different from ordinary sea water. The taste was awful, the bitter pungency of the manganese quite neutralizing that of the salt, and the water made a mosquito bite on my ankle smart terribly. The sun was too hot to make it safe to stay in the water more than a minute or two with the head unprotected, but the bath was worth the risk. It felt and looked more like bathing in oil than in water. The surface was still and smooth as the most perfect plate glass, and just as clear, despite the great depth of this, the northern half of the lake. 1,300 feet and more have been fathomed, yet in this vast volume of water not even the lowest organism can live. We gazed a while at Mount Nebo opposite, and the sheik pointed out a ruin in the hills of Judah behind us as the grave of Moses, on our own, the wrong side of the Dead Sea. Muslim tradition does not admit that no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. The Dead Sea is rather smaller in extent than the Lake of Geneva and only 9 miles across. The top of Pisgah frowned majestically before us nearly 5,000 feet high. Till one sees the character of the country and the marvelous clearness of the atmosphere, one cannot realize how from its summit Moses could have seen, as he gazed, long and lovingly, the whole of the promised land lying mapped out before him, all the land of Gilead unto Dan. Geological considerations make it almost impossible to assume that the sites of Sodom and Gomorrah are now covered by the waters of the Dead Sea. The chasm it occupies is primeval, and evaporation has made the sea shallower than it was, not deeper. There is nothing in the Bible narrative, nor, I believe, in Talmud or Midrash to lead us to assume that the cities of the plain were destroyed by water as well as fire. The sulfur and bitumen near the northern end, and perhaps, too, the lava, and other indications of volcanic agency there, point to the crumbling clay, in parts like quicksand treacherous to the foot, which extends between Jericho and the Bar El-Lit, Lot's Lake, as the more likely site. The only strong arguments to the contrary are the fanciful travelers' tales, of those who have ventured to navigate the sea, and assert that they have noticed ruins of towers and palaces in the depths below. It is possible that these accounts are not altogether drawn from the imagination. A haze often hangs over the sea, and, sometimes perhaps, the atmospheric conditions, which in the Straits of Messina give rise to the Fata Morgana, are here reproduced. The Jordan. From the Dead Sea we rode rapidly on to the ford of Jordan, or place of baptism, probably the site of Gilgal, and the place where Elijah ascended to heaven in a chariot of fire. Here again I bathed and swam across the stream, which was rapid and turbid, but almost as narrow as the mole at Esher, or the Thames above Henley. Childhood's preconceptions had, as Mark Twain says in his New Pilgrim's Progress, the best guide book to the Orient, pictured a mighty river 7,000 miles long and proportionally wide. In fact, it is about as long as the not less famous Thames, only much narrower. The water was warm, but after my bath in the Dead Sea and exposure to the fierce rays of the tropical sun, I found the shade of the thicket and cliffs made Jordan's water a most welcome change. It is as much discolored as that of the Nile, and, meeting some Russian pilgrims on their way to the only bath their religion enjoins and they can be persuaded to take, I could not help thinking that it was they and their like who had polluted the pristine purity of the snows of Hermon. We rode back through the jungle, in which we were not sorry to hear that lions are now scarcely ever to be met with, and returned home as quickly as we could. On the way we wondered at the almost inaccessible hermit cells in the rocks of the Jebel Karantel. We were on the other side of a deep gorge, and the caverns in which the poor devotees spend their lives seem, and no doubt originally were, the lairs of wild beasts. One blood-curdling track, I cannot call it path, was so precipitous that a little donkey was the only four-footed animal that would step upon it, and that had been trained to go on it ever since it could walk. We got back to Jerusalem shortly before 10 o'clock, after an absence of less than 24 hours, of which we had spent 19 in the saddle. We were very tired, but not too tired to do justice to supper, or to spend an hour in Mr. Kamenitz's drawing room listening to a concert, in which some ladies and gentlemen staying in the hotel took part. After the many disappointments, agreeable and otherwise, which we had experienced in our expedition, this music was not the least of the day's surprises. This is end of part 4. To listen to the next part, please click on the end screen playlist or video part 5. If you like the story, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. It costs nothing,